One fellow says, I can't see, I can't see. The other fellow says, what's the matter? The first fellow says, my eyes are closed. Such is the running gag in the Three Stooges episodes. Sometimes we can't see because our eyes are closed. And sometimes we can't see even though our eyes are open. A child can't see his shoes that are in plain sight. Sometimes adults have the same problem. And so we say, well, where is such and such? And it's usually the wife who says to the husband, if it had been a snake, it would have bit you. Well, some people have excellent physical vision, but are spiritually blind, and that's a very serious condition. Our text today involves 4 scenes that include 2 miracles, a confrontation, and a conversation. And all of them have some things to do with seeing. Our text is Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 26. Our first section is verses 1 through 10, the feeding of the 4,000. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance. His disciples answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also, and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 men were present. And having sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. Now, we have had the feeding of the 5,000. The feeding of the 5,000 is recorded in all 4 Gospels. And here we have the feeding of the 4,000 that's recorded by Mark and I believe also by Matthew. There are actually some Bible scholars who have tried to say, well, this is just one event told with different details. As we see from the text, that is not the case. There are some similarities, but there are some significant differences. The first of these may be the location. Jesus has been in Gentile territory, and he may still be there. If that is the case, the crowd that was listening to Jesus on this occasion was at least part Gentile. But we have here a situation where people were out in the deserted area, out in the wide open spaces, and they wanted to hear Jesus, and they had been with him 3 days. It could be that they had a little food with them when they left home, but what happens if you're gone longer than you expect? You run out of food. But at any rate, Jesus notices these people were without food. He had compassion for them. Once again, he involves the disciples. You know, if I send these people home, they may collapse on the way. They haven't had anything to eat for a while. And as in the feeding of the 5,000, the disciples say, well, you know, what do you expect us to do? In the feeding of the 5,000, they said, you know, where would we get enough money to buy that much food? But on this occasion, they said, we're out here in the middle of nowhere. Where are we going to find enough bread to feed these people? Jesus presents the disciples with the situation. Jesus knows he is the one who has the answer to the dilemma. Some may ask, well, you know, why is it the disciples? They've already seen Jesus feed 5,000 people with just a few loaves and fishes. Why are they perplexed here when this situation arises again? Well, we remember that Mark tells us that their hearts were hardened and they didn't understand. Well, Jesus says, how many loaves do you have? They said 7. He tells the crowd to sit down. He gives thanks for the loaves. they began to pass out the food. We also then have the detail that they found a few small fish. He gave thanks for those, and they passed those out as well. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, as in the feeding of the 5,000, the leftovers are gathered. In the feeding of the 5,000, the word for basket is kind of a small basket, like a lunch basket maybe. Here the word for basket is a huge basket. It's the same word that is used over in the book of Acts when they said they put the Apostle Paul in a basket and let him down through the wall to escape. At any rate, a large amount of food was produced to feed a large crowd, and of all things, they had a lot of leftovers. About 4,000 men were present, we're told. As in the feeding of the 5,000, after Jesus feeds the people, he sends them away. They're equipped for their journey home now. They've been fed. And as in the feeding of the 5,000, he and the disciples are going to end up in a boat. This time they go over to the region of Dalmanutha. Well, that brings us to our next section. The Pharisees demand a sign, verses 11 through 13. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. Now, Mark isn't giving us information here on where all of this is taking place exactly, but we can kind of guess that maybe these Pharisees, and they're always coming to Jesus to check up on him and try to incriminate him. It could very well be that they had just witnessed the feeding of the 4,000. That is a possibility. If not, they knew about the miracles Jesus had performed. And yet they come to him and they question him. Now, sometimes people ask you questions because they want information. Sometimes people ask you questions because they want to trip you up. They want you to say the wrong thing. They're going to use what you say against them. The latter case was the case with Jesus. The Pharisees were trying to get something on Jesus so that they could get rid of him. They question him. The question is a test. They ask him for a sign from heaven. As I've already mentioned, they've seen miracles. They've heard about the miracles, maybe even the feeding of the 4,000. What are they asking for? Now, John in his gospel, rather than using the word miracle, uses the word sign for miracle. I think here in Mark, sign is something more than just another miracle. They're not asking for him to heal somebody else or to raise somebody from the dead or that kind of thing. They're asking for something spectacular. It might be more along the lines of what the 3 disciples got to witness in the Transfiguration. But at any rate, they're saying, you know, your teaching isn't enough. The miracles you perform isn't enough. We need a surefire sign from heaven that confirms who you are. What is the reaction of Jesus? We've done that with our children, haven't we? I suppose wives have done it with their husbands. Sometimes our reaction to a situation is, Jesus sighs deeply. And he says, why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? He's already been doing miracles. He says, I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to it. Not to this generation. I believe in Matthew's account, there won't be a sign except for the sign of Jonah. Jonah was in the well of big fish for 3 days. Jesus will be in the tomb for 3 days and then be raised. But at any rate, you're not going to get a sign. Jesus knows that no matter what the Pharisees see, they are not going to believe in him. They cannot be convinced in their present situation of unbelief. They are indeed people who don't see. We could say they can't see because they have their eyes shut, their spiritual eyes shut. Well, Jesus gets back in the boat, which brings us to our third scene. And this involves the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod, verses 14 through 21. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, "It is because we have no bread." Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" They answered, 7. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?" This is the third boat scene in Mark. You've got the Sea of Galilee, the lake, very prominent to where the ministry of Jesus occurs. And so they're often out in the boat. And it says the disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for the one loaf they had with them on the boat. They apparently had left wherever they were in a hurry, didn't pack very much food, just had that one loaf of bread. This gives us the setting for Jesus' warning here. He says, be careful. Watch out for the yeast or the leaven of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Now, being a baker and making use of yeast and baking powder, and as Jay has been told over and over again, there is a difference between biscuits and rolls. It's the difference between baking powder and yeast. But at any rate, being one who uses these, I find in Scripture that yeast and leaven get a bad rap. They are almost used, most of the time they're used as a negative thing. When it speaks of something being leaven or of it being yeast, it is a spreading influence, but it is usually a bad influence. And we have seen how a little bad influence can quickly multiply. So Jesus gives the warning, watch out for what? The influence of the Pharisees. Well, we've just heard that they're seeking a sign. They're not going to get a sign because Jesus knows it won't change anything with them. Also, beware of the influence of Herod. Herod is a political leader. He is not a good spiritual person at all. John has been beheaded not too long before. But Jesus gives a warning. He's talking spiritual. The disciples start discussing what Jesus has just said. And they say it's because we have no bread. Jesus is expressing his concern because we didn't bring enough food with us. Well, Jesus knows what they're discussing. He says, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Are your hearts hardened? Now, we've already read that their hearts were hardened after the feeding of the 5,000 to where they didn't understand. You see, these 12 men who are spending hour after hour, day after day with Jesus have not yet got the message of who Jesus is. They too are not seeing. You can be with Jesus and not see who he is. You have to have your eyes open. In fact, Jesus says, do you have eyes but fail to see, ears but fail to hear? So he asked them some questions. And this verifies among all things that there were 2 different feeding occasions. But he says, okay, here's a little test. When I broke 5 loaves and fed 5,000 men, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12. They knew the answer. And when I fed the 4,000 with the 7 loaves, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered 7. Again, they're right. But then he says, do you still not understand? They had witnessed these 2 tremendous miracles of feeding people. Not to mention all the other miracles that they had witnessed. And they are not yet understanding who Jesus is. William L. Lane said, the disciples remembered the facts perfectly and responded to Jesus' questions without hesitation. Nevertheless, they failed to understand the significance of what had taken place before their eyes. They were no different than the unseeing crowd. And then in our last scene, we have the blind man at Bethsaida, however you say it, Bethsaida. Beginning with verse 22, they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home saying, don't go into the village. This miracle of healing is only recorded in Mark's gospel. We have here a man who is blind physically. He is different than the Pharisees and even the disciples. They were spiritually blind. This man is physically blind. And we note that this is the only 2-stage miracle in the gospel about Jesus. Why? Why did it take Jesus 2 tries to get the man to see clearly? Well, we know that Jesus had the ability to give him full sight all at once. He did it on other occasions. We know that Jesus could heal people by remote. He didn't even have to be present. There must have been a reason that Jesus does this healing in 2 stages. First, Jesus touches the man, put the spit on his eyes, says, do you see anything? Man says, well, I can see. Kind of looks like trees walking around. So he didn't have clear sight. Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes a second time. And then he could see everything clearly. Perhaps there is something of a parable of the disciples' slowness to believe, to fully understand who Jesus is. The disciples have been with Jesus. They know something about him. They trust him enough to follow him. But they don't yet fully know who he is. In a sense, Jesus needs to touch them again for them to see clearly. What has happened here in Jesus' conversation with his disciples about the leaven, about their understanding, in this healing of the blind man? We're setting the stage for a great turning point in the ministry of Jesus. We will have Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi. The 12 are beginning to see, but they They need more of Jesus' touch in order to see clearly. But what is the primary lesson of this text for us? Are there times we need a second touch of Jesus also? Are there times that we can't see because we have our eyes closed? Makes it very hard to see, doesn't it? If we have our eyes closed spiritually, if we let prejudiced or preconceived ideas or other factors get in the way, it keeps us from seeing Jesus, the true Jesus as he is recorded in the Gospels. Sometimes we have correct information. We can answer all the questions correctly. But it hasn't affected us to have a relationship with Jesus. If we don't see it first, we need to look again. And we always need to try to have our eyes open to Jesus.